All right. Okay. Torture begins. 3, 2, 1.
That should be our cold open.
That's
Torture begins.
Torture
it's time for
begins.
Sound Politics. I'm Scott Greenstone.
And I'm Libby Denkman.
And it is an apprehensive week, I would say, in Seattle. And, I don't know, the country.
Yeah.
I think.
It's fair.
Yeah, we're preparing, right? Everyone's kind of looking ahead to the weekend because there's a military parade in the Capitol on Trump's birthday.
And technically the 250th anniversary of the Army. And this whole thing where it falls on Trump's birthday, that's a big coincidence. It's interesting that that's happening, Scott. Yeah.
Another coincidence is there are around 80 No Kings protests planned statewide, thousands planned nationwide. Seattle, Olympia, Tacoma. Organizers say that they're expecting millions of people to show up on the streets around the country this weekend. So I think, the ramp up in the tension, the reason I'm saying for this apprehensiveness is because of another thing Trump has done with the military, right? Order them into L.A. to respond to protests there. And, before we get to our guest for this week, I am kind of curious. One of the reactions that you have been gathering among many, Libby, is from Washington's Attorney General, Nick Brown. He got really intense in how he talked about it.
I think it was interesting because I've interviewed Nick Brown, as you have, from his campaign to after he was elected to now he's about 4 months into office, 4 or 5 months.
Yeah.
And he's really gone on a journey where when he was first elected, he did not want to come out and say, I'm going to sue the Trump administration 300 times, compared to my predecessor, Bob Ferguson. He was very in a wait and see mode.
Yeah,
and
conservative-ish.
Monday, when I spoke with him, he came out hard and said, we are seeing authoritarianism in what we're seeing in Los Angeles. We're seeing dictatorial behavior, characteristics of a fascist government. Yeah. Trump has argued that this military action was necessary because there's chaos in the streets. There's radical left lunatics. Demonstrations in Los Angeles, we should say, have been largely peaceful. Yeah. But there were also things that got out of hand. Demonstrators burned 5 or 6 Waymos, threw fireworks at police.
Those are the autonomous cars, Waymos.
Yeah, and they were called to the demonstrations and then were burned. But California officials, including Mayor Karen Bass and Governor Gavin Newsom, have said LAPD had it handled. And having reported on a lot of protests in 2020 in LA, these are things that LAPD is very versed in handling. And nevertheless, the president moved quickly to send in troops. Now we see protests popping up in other cities, including in Seattle. You covered one of those downtown earlier this week, right, Scott?
Yeah. In Seattle, the last several days have all had protests of varying sizes. I covered kind of a smaller one on Tuesday, and you cover these protests. A lot of the sounds are often the same: chanting, cheering, marching. The sound that I keep thinking about this one that I went to, actually, I think we can play it.
Oh, I know what that is. Oh no.
So that is a Lime bike chirping the little, I'm being stolen chirp. But it's not it's being dragged and thrown onto a barricade. So basically demonstrators blocked the exit ramps out of the federal building downtown. So this is immigration court in downtown Seattle. And in this Henry M. Jackson federal building, ICE has been detaining immigrants, sometimes who come out of their federal court hearings. They can get them on a plane out of the country, according to their lawyers, within hours after they leave this building. So the protesters were trying to stop that. And, they threw barricades of Lime bikes, e-scooters, all these things, zip-tied some of them together, sprayed cooking oil on them so they would be slippery. So
I didn't know about the zip ties.
Yeah. So I mean, I bring that up, after I left that protest, there were clashes with police. There were 2 arrests. There were rocks thrown at the windows. Like you mentioned, a lot of the discourse about the protests, including the one yesterday, too, which was after the one that I went to.
Yeah.
After darkness falls and a big chunk of the peaceful protesters go home, sometimes the police come and face off with the protesters.
Yeah, that's the story that you see over and over again, right? The organizers who first start out with this idea, we're going to do this action, we're going to have this gathering, you can't always control who shows up. And then
Yeah.
oftentimes as the day goes on, as, night falls, people get more and more chaotic. The people who stick around. Our colleague Casey Martin reported last night, Wednesday night, that a smaller group of protesters vandalized the federal building, set a dumpster on fire, burned an American flag, shot off fireworks. There were 8 arrests, but that was after a big gathering in Cal Anderson Park that the Seattle police said resulted in a march down to the federal building. All of that was peaceful. So it's sort of like these things devolve later in the night. And it was after 10 o'clock when those arrests happened. The other protesters that showed up to support immigrants and just kind of, make their say, a lot of those people go home by that time.
Right. Yeah. And some of them left once it started getting violent, saying like they don't support the fires or the fights with law enforcement. They just want to support immigrants. That's a common story. The property damage and the clashes with police are things Trump is definitely bringing up a lot online right now.
Yeah, and you heard Bob Ferguson, the governor, say this today, that people who are doing property damage, people who are causing that chaos, they are playing into Trump's hands. But we want to talk more about that with our guest today. And we also want our guest today to respond to something that happened last week on our show on Sound Politics when I wasn't here.
Yes.
Scott, tell us more about that.
So last week, Kshama Sawant came on to call out Seattle area Congressman Adam Smith, your old boss.
That's right.
Sawant is running to take over Smith's seat in the 2026 election.
It's always a trip to interview my former boss. It's been many years. But Adam Smith, he's been reelected every cycle since joining Congress in 1997. Sawant, though, she says she's up to taking him out.
And she's fiercely criticizing him over the war in Gaza and the rising death toll. She called him a war cheerleader, which I thought was interesting. So Congressman Adam Smith represents Washington's 9th District. That includes parts of Seattle, Renton, Bellevue, Kent, Federal Way, and Auburn. Congressman, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for giving me the chance.
I want to start with the protests this week. Of course, I think that's on everyone's minds, probably top of their minds. In L.A., Trump mobilized the National Guard against the wishes of the mayor and the governor of California, which has not happened since the civil rights era. Protests have spread to other cities like Seattle, where some big ones are planned for this weekend. Some Democrats, this is what I want to ask you about, some Democrats have criticized some of the demonstrators in LA and their tactics, particularly the fringe elements who lobbed concrete at California Highway Patrol and burned driverless cars. And Senator Bernie Sanders said on X, violent protests are counterproductive and play right into Trump's playbook. Are you worried that some images like vandalism or flag burning could hurt Democrats' message? How are you threading that needle?
Well, I am vastly more worried about Trump using the military as his personal police force and taking us one giant step down the road of an authoritarian government. I mean, what was going on in Los Angeles was at the start, I think 100, maybe 150 protesters expressing their displeasure at Trump's immigration policy. And, the ICE officials were perfectly able. They carried out, they arrested who they wanted to arrest. They detained who they wanted to detain, and they deported people. They were able to do their job, first of all. And second of all, to the few protesters who were there who did engage in criminal acts, the LAPD was there. I mean, you saw the pictures long before the National Guard showed up. LAPD was there, dressed up in riot gear, ready to go. They had the situation under control. So the question is, why did Trump then call in 4,000 National Guardsmen and 700 active duty Marines, the latter part being really unprecedented, to go to the active duty force to bring them in? And I think the answer to that question is he wants to set a precedent. He wants to establish his right to use the United States military for primarily his political purposes. So that is the number one thing that we have to be worried about. Obviously, Senator Sanders is right. Violent protests play into Trump's hands. There is no question about that. And, I don't think that's a good idea. But nor do I think we should amplify that too much, because it's not really happening that much. And to the extent that it's happening, it's primarily in response to Trump's escalation of this situation. But yeah, there is a risk here. There's a risk for all of us in that Trump wants this fight. He wants it for a variety of different reasons. And there are some radicals who want this fight too. You've heard the conversations. We're in a civil war. We should fight. I don't agree with that. I don't think that is the approach to stopping this authoritarian regime. But for the moment, it's a relatively small group of people that are doing that. And the far larger danger is what I outlined about what President Trump is doing with the United States military in domestic law enforcement situations.
And I want to ask about that, Congressman. As an attorney, you're a former prosecutor, you're the top Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee. We heard yesterday that active duty Marines who are soon to be deployed to Los Angeles can detain people until police arrive. They do not have arrest authority. They will reportedly be protecting government buildings and guarding ICE officers while they're on raids. There are laws in this country against using the active duty military for law enforcement on domestic soil. Do you feel that this operation violates the law?
100%, in a couple of different ways. First of all, if you're detaining someone, you are engaging in a law enforcement activity. Number one. Number two, the statute, and there's a tortured history here that would send me way down a rabbit hole of legalese. But there is a statute, and then there's an interpretation of Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution that has justified the use of Guard and Reserve units with local government approval to help, federal employees who are not able to do their job. All right. If local law enforcement is unable to contain the situation. But that does not apply here because, again, local law enforcement was perfectly able to do it, and the local federal folks were perfectly able to do their job. So if you had a situation where, a large mob of protesters were blocking a group of federal employees from getting into their offices and doing anything, first, you would see what local law enforcement would do. And then after that, there could be a justification. But that's not the situation here. So what President Trump is doing and how he is using the U.S. military is clearly against federal law.
I think here in Seattle, we are watching. There are many people that are watching this with anxiety, flashbacks maybe to 2020. I mean, I know Trump thinks about the protests here in Seattle a lot. He brought them up at both debates last year, both presidential debates. I'm thinking about Seattle's police chief has said he expects to be jailed under the Trump administration for standing up for people's First Amendment right to protest, that he thinks that may happen. Does a showdown here feel inevitable to you? How likely do you think it is that the president would, send troops here to Seattle?
Oh, it's not inevitable, but it is vastly more likely than any of us should want it to be. Again, because President Trump wants this fight. And there are some, radical folks who, like I said, they're ready for the revolution. And they want that fight too. We're going to really need to work hard to make sure that calmer heads in the middle can keep either of those things from happening. But it is worrisome. And part of the problem is, in 2020, Governor Inslee asked for federal help. All right. He asked the Trump administration for federal help. The CHOP zone, things were out of control in Seattle and in some other cities as well. You had widespread looting. You had things being set on fire. You had law enforcement officers being attacked. You can't deny that things were out of control. Crucially, that is not the situation that existed in Los Angeles when President Trump called in 4,000 National Guardsmen and 700 active duty Marines. So the one thing is not connected to the other, except to the extent that President Trump is using it as a pretext to continue his march towards an authoritarian government where he, as president, is unchecked by the normal checks on presidential power.
Adam, we've invited you on Sound Politics specifically because Kshama Sawant was a guest last week. She is the former city council member. She announced that she's running against you in the 9th District as an independent. And she's very focused on foreign policy, on the war in Gaza. She has criticized you for voting to give Israel millions in weaponry, called you a, quote, war hawk on this show. She says by continuing to support military funding for Israel, you are denying genocide. And I want to give you a chance to respond to a number of those very serious attacks that she lobbed last week. Is it fair to hold you responsible for what's happening in Gaza, especially civilian deaths?
Well, first of all, let's be very clear on Kshama Sawant. We're talking about how do we contain Donald Trump's power. And it's really frustrating. I've got a couple emails and texts. What are we doing? Where is the checks and balances? And here we have in Kshama Sawant, a woman who did more than anybody outside of the Trump campaign to put Trump in office. She actively campaigned against Kamala Harris in Michigan to help elect Donald Trump. I'll tell you, the number one biggest issue that my constituents care about is who's going to stand up to Trump and all the stuff that we just talked about. And I've been doing that. Gosh, I've been doing that since 2016, but straight through. So can we really afford to have a member of Congress who's going to help Donald Trump get elected and stay in power? I don't think so. As far as whether or not I'm personally responsible for civilian deaths in Gaza, no, I am absolutely not. We make foreign policy, we make national security decisions. I mean, is someone who's sympathetic to Palestine personally responsible for October 7th? Hell no. Of course they're not. Okay. You can have opinions and positions on policy that others take in different directions and not be responsible for it. Also, I have been advocating for a ceasefire in Gaza since I think like last February or March. I didn't advocate for it the day after October 7th, or even within the 2-month time frame when a group of protesters, protesters, wrong word, a group of vandals actually vandalized my house because I wouldn't support a unilateral ceasefire. I support a ceasefire with the hostages returned. That is the ceasefire I support. There's been a couple of those. I've supported those. I've also been perfectly willing to put pressure on Israel over a wide range of issues. Now, Israel faces an existential threat, and they have since they were created. The players have changed. Originally, it was 7 of their surrounding countries that attacked them. Now it's Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and Iran. But defending themselves against that existential threat is extraordinarily difficult. And also, Hamas, the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Iran are not the kind of people we should be supporting. How do we stop them? Iran has twice launched full-scale ballistic and other missile attacks against Israel. I support Israel's right to defend themselves against those attacks, even as I have been publicly critical of a number of things that Prime Minister Netanyahu have done. I think this business of saying that elected officials, just casting aspersions at them, they're responsible for this, they're responsible for that. We've got a representative democracy. We have to make difficult decisions. And it's a tough balance in trying to figure out how to end the war between Israel and the Palestinians, which has been going on for, almost 100 years now.
On this current military operation by Israel, the death toll in Gaza, more than 50,000, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. There are a number of groups who are saying that Gaza is on the brink of famine. There are criticisms of the way that Israel has first blockaded and then highly limited humanitarian aid there. What tools do you support to pressure Israel on addressing the death toll or addressing humanitarian issues in Gaza? Like, where is the line, and
I think
what
we
do
should
you
speak out
think should
publicly,
happen?
and I have spoken out publicly against this effort. I've spoken out publicly in favor of ceasefire. I've spoken out publicly in favor of getting humanitarian assistance, of getting UNRWA money so they can continue to fund humanitarian assistance. I think it's perfectly appropriate to do that. Now, Kshama Sawant is going to want to make this campaign all about Gaza. I happen to think it's also about the 9th District. Who's going to represent the people of the district, which I have been doing very, effectively for a long time now, because I prioritize my constituents. When Kshama Sawant was a Seattle City Council person, she was even then it's like she was on the Foreign Affairs Committee. She wasn't looking after her constituents. I have worked on building housing, on building community centers, on helping with roads and transportation, on helping support our local law enforcement. No member of Congress has a better constituent service effort than I have, and no member of Congress has done as effective job of standing up for working people in my district. I am a blue-collar kid from the district who stands up for working people. I was just about the first elected official in the country to endorse the first $15 minimum wage in the city of SeaTac. City of SeaTac, where I grew up, first city in the nation to have a $15 minimum wage. So my constituents are going to want someone who's fighting for working people, fighting back against Trump and doing the day in and day out work of listening to constituents and responding to their needs. Kshama Sawant is going to be what she's always been. She's going to be about Kshama Sawant. She's going to be about performative politics. I'm about delivering for the people in my district who have a lot of needs, especially in the face of the Trump administration assault.
Since you're talking about yourself, you're talking about your district, I do want to bring up one other criticism she has of you, is that, your number one donor, according to Open Secrets, is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC.
That's not actually true, but that's okay.
Who is it? Sorry.
Well, they're a PAC. They can give $10,000. They gave a whole lot of people have given me $10,000, and a whole lot of individuals have given me money as well. And by the way that Open Secrets calculates, AIPAC donations, because they count individual donations as well. They assume those individual donations are associated with AIPAC. Well, how do they determine that an individual is associated? Well, has that individual supported AIPAC-backed candidates? Well, I'm an AIPAC-backed candidate. So you add it all. 95% of my donations have come from AIPAC. That's what the site says. That simply isn't true. Sorry, I think it's AIPAC plus defense company. 95%? Not true.
Future Scott here. We did some digging and talked to Open Secrets to clarify, and even looked at a couple of the FEC records. So Open Secrets says that Smith got almost $330,000 from AIPAC in 2023 and 2024. That would be his single biggest donor. Open Secrets says these are earmarked donations. So essentially, AIPAC is acting as the conduit between the individual donors and Smith. Okay, back to past Scott. Whatever the money is, are you concerned that AIPAC would pull money from you if you don't align with their legislative agenda?
No, they've done it before. Back in 2018, I signed on to a letter that Illa Omar led about continuing to fund UNRWA. And, they didn't support me as a result of that. I've never had any problem having donors not give me money. Look, the part of the reason that AIPAC gave me so much money in the last cycle was because my home was vandalized. I was one of the first elected officials in the country to be a victim of that. The Israeli ambassador called me. A whole bunch of people called me from all over the country. And as a result, they sent me money. Okay. I've been critical of Israel since then. They have not sent me as much this cycle. But it's ironic that the people who are criticizing me for that are the ones who sort of drove it by attacking me in my private residence because I wasn't supporting a ceasefire right after October 7th. So, look, I am not capable of being bought by anybody. I take donations, I vote my district, I vote my conscience. And I've lost a fair number of donors. In fact, I'll say something that may get me in trouble in half of this. BlackRock, who's a famous hedge fund, has from time to time supported me. I have a bill right now blocking institutional investors from buying up single family homes. And we had called up BlackRock to see if they would support me. And they said no because of that bill. C'est la vie. Okay. We had a long conversation about, why they thought I was wrong and why I'm convinced that I'm right. And so they don't support me. Look, Kshama Sawant raises a lot of money from individual donors that are on the left side of the political spectrum. Would she ever take a position that left side of the political spectrum didn't want and jeopardize her donor base? We'll see. But I've taken countless positions that have gone directly against people who have donated money to me. And sometimes they stop, and that's fine.
Since you brought up your, the left wing and I am curious I haven't talked to you since you kind of have made more headlines in recent months talking about your feeling that the extreme left wing of the party is leading the Democratic Party and institution into a ditch. And obviously Kshama Sawant is not a Democrat, is not running as a Democrat, but she was the most left-leaning member.
Well, she's absolutely what I'm talking about.
Sure.
Let me just mend that. And I've mended that. I've spoken with Libby about this before.
Yeah.
I don't think it's just the left. Frankly, I've had conversations about centrist policy as well. My big complaint right now is you've got the far left and the centrists, both of whom want to prove that they've never been wrong about anything. When in fact, what we need to do as a party is to really look at some of the policies. And look, I think centrist policies didn't do enough to provide for broad-based economic opportunity. I think centrist policies led us into too many wars that lasted too long. No question about it. What I want the party to do is have an open and honest conversation about what we're doing well and what we're doing poorly, and not be so deeply invested in making sure that our ideological wing wins the fight. We got to build a coalition. We have to, and our coalition, by the way, it needs to be bigger than it was in 2024. We need to reach people who we haven't reached before. That the only thing is, I'm just not afraid to be critical of positions that the progressive left have taken. I think they're right about a lot. I just mentioned the minimum wage. I mentioned my housing bill. I consider myself a progressive. I think they're right about a lot of things. They are a little overly sensitive to any sort of policy criticism, as you may have noticed. And that's the part that I want all of us Democrats to get over. Let's learn, let's grow, let's figure out how to do better policy for the people we're supposed to be representing. But no, I would not characterize it as saying, oh, the left is killing us. Certain aspects of their policy could maybe be adjusted. Same's true of centrists and a lot of others. Same's true of me over the course of how many years. I've learned and changed policy in a number of different areas.
Adam, your mentioning of the minimum wage in CTAC kind of echoes the way we're hearing a lot from Kshama Sawant about her championing the minimum wage increase in Seattle to $15 an hour. She says she knows how to build working class coalitions and never count her out of an election. She had a lot of people saying, she was going to lose that recall. She ended up pulling it out. And I'm curious, now that we're looking at a race that is mostly outside of Seattle, the 9th District, we're talking about places like Kent, Auburn, Federal Way. She says she knows how to build coalitions everywhere. How is your sales pitch going to be better in order to say, hey, I'm the guy that, knows how to deliver that and knows how to deliver a win for the Democratic Party? How do you think that's going to play?
Well, I bring people together to solve problems. Kshama Sawant divides them and makes them angry. And no place is that more clear than the way she divided the party to put Donald Trump in the White House. Here we have an executive bent on authoritarian takeover of the government, and Kshama Sawant was just fine with him getting elected. I think because it served her purposes. So I don't have a problem with that. And also, I don't think the people in my district support defunding the police and abolishing the criminal justice system. She was an aggressive advocate for those policies. As far as I know, she hasn't changed her mind. I haven't looked recently. So I bring people together and solve problems. She yells at people and irritates people. I don't know. I think my approach is better and is going to deliver better for the people in the 9th District.
Congressman Adam Smith represents Washington's 9th District. Really appreciate your time today, Congressman. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Libby and Scott. Always appreciate the conversation.
That's it for Sound Politics today. Our show is produced by Hans Anderson. Our editor is Kat Smith, and I'm Libby Dankman.
And I'm Scott Greenstone. This show is only possible because of your support. Please consider a donation to keep us going at KUOW.org/politics. Also, questions. Send us your questions. soundpolitics@KUOW.org. We read them all. We try to respond to them all, and we try to even answer some of them. So please send them. soundpolitics@KUOW.org. We'll see you next week.
Bye.